to another episode of My Soul Connection and the final episode of Season 1. I'm your host, Billie Kavert. Yes, the final episode. I've decided that I'm going to do this in seasons for a couple of reasons. First off, as many of you know, I started this podcast as a way to make sense of my own spiritual awakening, which happened between 8 and 10 years ago. And I wanted to share this information with people so that they didn't have to learn the hard way like I did, and they could use some of the same tools and resources that I used to help get them unstuck, to feel more aligned with their lives, and hopefully get them feeling more connected to themselves and others around them. With that, one of the things I learned is how much freaking work a podcast is. Oh my gosh, didn't know what I was getting into there, but it's been really fun. And I really appreciate all the people who have come on the show and have shared their stories and their offerings. So I hope that some of you are inspired enough to take action in your own lives and to utilize the resources that you've been given through this podcast. So with that, today's episode is really going to be a recap of the whole entire podcast series because there's been so much information given. And I know that my episodes tend to be a little bit long. That's something I'm working on. So I'm hoping that this recap can remind you of things that really meant something to you so that you can go back and take a listen or take action on something that you heard at one point but maybe forgot about. Or maybe you'll realize that there was an episode you missed and you'll go back and listen to find something new here. But either way, I'm really proud of what I've put out. It's kind of interesting how it shows the whole arc of my own journey, although there's never an end to a spiritual journey. I feel like I'm truly just beginning. But season 1 has really been about remembering who we are underneath the surface, underneath all the layers and the conditioning and the identities that we've built in effort to succeed in life. So let's talk first about episode 1 with Rosie Acosta, where the awakening began. The conversation with Rosie mostly had to do with stillness, resilience, and self-reflection. Unfortunately, awakening often begins with some type of disruption, but I'm hoping that by sharing these things on this podcast, you don't have to go through that, or you have a minimal disruption in your life. For me, that realization was that productivity isn't everything, and it's not the same as being fulfilled. Many of us build our lives around achievement and success, but we feel internally disconnected, and we continue to live in a way where we get further and further disconnected from ourselves. And then we end up several years down the road not even recognizing ourselves anymore. Like we don't really know how we got to that place. So learning to practice being still is really where all the clarity began for me. Learning and practicing being still is not a passive sport. It seems so simple, yet it's so complicated because we muster up lots of thoughts in our head during the moments we're still, and we just don't know what to do with that energy. But the doing nothing and the getting used to day in and day out, the practice of being still and being quiet really helps to let things bubble to the surface, and then you know what you're working with. We also learned in this episode that childhood conditioning really shapes our identity and our self-worth. And that's not to say that I'm talking exclusively about how your parents raised you. As I've mentioned many times, I was raised in a very stable, loving household. I had a happy life, a happy childhood, but it's so much more than that. It's about societal conditioning. It's about how you fit in or don't at school. It's about relationship with friends, with members of the opposite sex, with teachers, with the community. And in my case, some not so great choices I made in my teenage years, especially as it related to some of my boyfriends. But when I'm talking about childhood conditioning, I'm talking about all of that. And it wasn't until my adult years that I started to realize I was carrying the weight of all of that with me and how much that was influencing my behaviors and my patterns and ways that I showed up for my loved ones that was kind of toxic, and for myself, kind of toxic, even the negative self-talk and limiting beliefs. When you eventually become aware, you realize that healing isn't really about fixing yourself. It's about remembering who you are and who you were before you believed certain things about yourself and before you started to put limits on who you could become. One of the things we also talked about during that episode was how support and connection are essential parts of transformation. So having a good therapist or a coach who can help you see things that you can't is really, really helpful. So in wrapping up episode 1, I think the real key point for me was that success didn't necessarily mean alignment, and that life wasn't really about proving myself or gaining validation along the way. Moving on to episode 2, where I got the privilege of talking to Bill Donius about rediscovering your intuition and your inner authority. I think the key to this episode is really understanding that we each have our own innate inner wisdom that we can tap into, and there's a variety of different ways you can do so. But we've been conditioned not to trust it. We've been conditioned to go to external resources to get answers instead of looking inside of ourselves. But intuition is accessible to everyone, regardless of your background and your financial status. And it's key to understand that the rational mind often overrides the deeper knowing. So, asking the right questions helps to bring clarity. We talked about intuitive writing, which is essentially non dominant handwriting, how it can reconnect you with your authentic voice. And we talked about how transformation begins when you listen to what's inside of you as opposed to searching externally for answers. If you missed this episode, go back and give it a listen. And if it speaks to you, try the intuitive writing thing for 30 days. I mean, what can it hurt? It does take a little bit of practice. I think after a few days, if you do it regularly, you'll start to see how you can unlock things that you haven't been able to get to for quite some time. Moving on to episode 3. This was about the hidden emptiness behind achievement, where I spoke with John Berkeley, who was a friend I met at a retreat, and he was a former tech CEO, about his experience from corporate success to self discovery. I think the story that he shares is really great for a lot of men out there because you're hearing a lot of female voices in this space. But I think it's good to hear from men who've had a very successful career and who also admit that they felt very disconnected and what they did about it. So the main thing I learned from John kind of relates back to what I said about myself from the productivity angle, that success does not guarantee fulfillment. Many high achievers feel spiritually empty despite their external success. And corporate identities have a tendency to mask deeper emotional needs. Now, that's not to blame corporate. I'm just saying that as people work for years and years and years in the corporate environment where success is measured in certain ways and also validated and rewarded in certain ways, it's very easy to start climbing that corporate ladder and just completely lose yourself and begin to over-identify with your corporate role. But what John taught us is through therapy, becoming more vulnerable, asking a lot of questions of himself, and spending some time being really introspective, that reflection can create a space for healing. So just remember that identity can start to form kind of as a coping mechanism, not coming from your authenticity. And when you start to question that, things can become a little bit more clear there. In episode 4, I got to reconnect with an old friend who I went to high school with, Hollis Tuttle, about reconnecting with the body as a gateway to the soul. This was one of my favorite episodes, not because I thought it was so earth shattering, but because I'm a health nut. Hollis is clearly a health nut, but it's not just about exercising and eating right. It's about looking at the whole body and understanding how intertwined it is and interconnected. You can't have good mental health without having good physical health and vice versa. So, what we learned from Hollis is that body is not separate from healing, it's central to it. Physical health and emotional healing are deeply interconnected. Strength training builds psychological strength, not just physical strength. And we all know that movement releases emotional patterns that are stuck in the body. You've probably heard the term many times, our issues are in our tissues. And if you don't release that energy through some sort of physical movement, it will stay stuck in there. Another topic that we talked about, which I really appreciated, is how aging can be a period of empowerment, not decline. I certainly feel that way. I'm 49 now. I think Hollis is as well. And we both feel like we're in a better place mentally, emotionally, and physically than we've ever been in our lives. And that comes from a sense of taking care of our whole being. So just remember that transformation isn't just mental or spiritual, it's embodied. And when I think about what the word embodied means, somebody who is embodied is very present. They're not scattered, they're not performative, they're not disconnected. When they're in the room, you really feel their presence. They're very grounded. Also, I think their words really match their energy. So, in other words, what they say actually aligns with how they show up in person. There's congruence between their body language, their tone, and their message. And they feel their emotions instead of just intellectualizing them. They don't just talk about feelings conceptually, they actually experience and allow them. And lastly, they really learn to trust their bodies. They make decisions based on internal cues, not just logic or external validation. So, reconnecting with the body is the foundation, and it's what brings you back to yourself. But embodiment alone doesn't automatically create alignment. It's also important to understand how we're uniquely wired, which is what we uncovered in episodes 5 and 6 when I talked to Nadia Last and Sam Pfotenhauer about human design. Human design was a really popular episode, and I think it's because people have never heard of this idea of an energetic blueprint. So, alignment begins with understanding your nature and not forcing certain outcomes or forcing yourself into roles that just don't fit. A few specific things to remind you about human design. Each person has their own unique energetic blueprint. Misalignment can create frustration, burnout, and resistance. So if you don't know what your human design is and you learn about it, you'll start to connect the dots about why you've been really frustrated in certain areas of your life. And what we also find is that much of our suffering comes from trying to be someone we're not. Not necessarily that you're faking it in life, but you just think you're going down the right path because you're following a path of success that other people have had, but that's not necessarily how you uniquely operate. So, human design helps us really develop self trust and honoring our natural energy patterns. And with that, we have to start to unlearn and decondition ourselves, which is the process of returning to our authentic selves. And once you get on that path and you see that, it's very hard to unsee, and things will keep unfolding for you. So, just know that not everyone is meant to succeed in the same way. And if you're not aware of what your human design is, I would highly encourage you to go on to Sam and Nadia's website, which is moonrisecommunity.com, and get a free chart. But you'll probably get that and not know what to do with it. So if you want to take it a step further, you can pay, I think it's $60 to get a full-fledged report, which is a really helpful place to start. And then you can even take it to the next level and schedule a one-on-one human design reading with one of them. In episode 7, I took a little bit of a detour and talked about my alcohol-free journey, which is where I explored the unexpected upside of choosing to be alcohol-free for a year. And I still have not drank, so I went through all of 2025 and a couple months now into 2026, and I just feel too good to go back to it. Again, as I mentioned in episode 7, I don't know for sure that I'll never go back to it, but as of now, I just feel too good about where I am that I don't think I want to open that can of worms again. I didn't know it at the time when I was making the commitment to not drink in 2025, but this was really all about breaking unconscious patterns that I had that I didn't even recognize. And awareness of these unconscious habits created freedom for me, which happens to be one of my core values. So, this was a huge turning point in 2025 for me. What I learned through the journey, and you can go back and listen, obviously, but it was that alcohol was really masking a lot of anxiety, stress, and emotional discomfort, while also simultaneously creating more anxiety for me because of a lot of the social situation, social pressure, and just habit that I had formed. But when you remove numbing behaviors, it reveals deeper truths. So being alcohol free has given me clarity, it's given me emotional stability, and it's given me a level of awareness, which has really increased my level of self trust. It also forced me to break some societal conditioning, which personal growth often requires. And interestingly enough, just last night, I read a quote by one of my biggest expanders, somebody I really admire, a guy named Mark Groves. Some of you may know him. And I want to read a quote that I read from him last night. Just thought this was extremely valuable. He said this: remember that who people expect you to be is often because you unconsciously create an agreement with them. It's not their fault that they're reacting to who you used to be. And in order for you to heal the codependent prison that made you create contracts based on an inauthentic self, you have to hold the tension of their discomfort and not collapse back into who you were. Is that not so true? That's a lot. And you can rewind that if you need to hear it again. But for me, so much of that relates back to the drinking culture that I was very much a part of. And I found that when you're growing personally, you are changing. And when you become a different person, it really makes other people uncomfortable because they just don't know how to perceive you anymore as this new version of yourself. But that's okay. Let them be uncomfortable. Hold space for their discomfort, but don't revert back to who you were just because it's kind of uncomfortable to be around them because they're uncomfortable. You know what I mean? The freedom really begins with questioning behaviors that we and society have normalized. So I hope that that gives you some inspiration, not just about alcohol, but about other behaviors that you may want to look at that were really just taught to you by society. All right, now it's time to look at where you're playing small instead of stepping into your whole self. And I think in episode 8, my conversation with Cyril Derameau about trusting your intuition and how much courage it requires. Tapping into your intuition often calls for you to be beyond your comfort zone. If you have an intuitive hit to go do something that requires courage, sometimes people just draw back and don't do it because it's just easier and it's uncomfortable to take that big leap. But courage isn't the absence of fear, it's movement despite fear. It's taking aligned action despite the fear. Following intuition really leads to an expansion, and then meaning comes from that experience, not security. If you think about it, yes, security makes you feel safe and you have some certainty there, but it's also a little bit boring. I mean, life just gets a little dull when you're just always in this very comfortable, secure, and certain place. So, learning to trust yourself and be courageous is really the ultimate act of freedom. And alignment requires action, not just awareness. Another way to uncover a different level of awareness, although not recommended for anyone and everyone, is through the powerful and revelatory experience that you can get from psychedelic medicine. In episode 9, I talked with Nick Baker and Claire Johnson about my journey at their psilocybin retreat. For me, this was really an act of healing through surrender and letting go of control, but everyone's experience, of course, is going to be different. But what I learned was that transformation comes from surrender, not force, and that there are no quick fixes in life. You have to work at everything, even through a psychedelic journey. And if this is something that you're really considering, just make sure you take safety first and think about the fact that the key to having a positive therapeutic experience is having the right practitioners in the right setting. Another thing I learned during my psychedelic journey is that compassion and forgiveness are central to healing. And actually, for me, it was compassion and forgiveness for myself. Going back to the idea of surrender, we have to remember that ego really resists surrender, but surrender creates freedom. Also, the reason psychedelics work is because they create new neural pathways, and then letting go of certain things during your journey can create space for a new identity to emerge. But regardless of whether we're talking about psychedelics or anything else, integration is a key aspect of anything that you learn, right? You have to come back and integrate it into your life somehow. And that's essential for lasting change. And it's having the right community and support around you can really help you amplify the integration process. And speaking of creating space and integration, that's what I talk about in episode 10, which is applying the Marie Kondo method to your physical, mental, and emotional environment as well. So, finding alignment partially requires removing what no longer belongs in your life to create space. And just remember, your schedule really reflects your identity and your priorities. So, if you're looking at your schedule and you're thinking that this does not reflect my priorities, then you have some misalignment you need to address. So, by clearing space, whether we're talking about physical, emotional, or mental, clearing space and letting go of the things that no longer serve you creates clarity. And then you have agency over designing how you want life to look. So just think less creates more alignment. And finally, I ended on episode 11, where I discussed ego death and rebuilding your identity with Dion Jensen. What we learned is that success often reinforces ego-based identity, something I addressed in episode 1 with Rosie and that I addressed also with John Berkeley in episode 3. So you can tell this is a recurring theme, right? Ego death, though, can be gradual, or for some, like Dion, it can be a very abrupt way of shedding your identity. And one thing I really appreciated is how we took a deep look at how fear and anxiety are often tied to future outcomes that we're attached to, which is another way of saying control. Like we want to control our future. We want to know how everything's going to unfold. So Dion helps us remember how important it is just to stay present and not be so focused on rehashing the past or trying to plan out our futures. Presence is the key. And authenticity requires unlearning inherited stories. This was a huge revelation. Have you ever thought about the stories that you've heard your entire life and you just take them on to be true at face value? I mean, we've all played the telephone game, right? So I think it's time to take a look at these stories and how they've shaped our lives and question whether or not it serves us to hang on to them. Dion and I also talked about how love and connection deepens when your ego loosens. So when you start taking that mask off and showing your authentic self to your friends, your loved ones, your coworkers, there is a deeper connection that you have with people. And then you also feel that there's a more authentic connection because now they're connecting with who you really are, not with that person who's just wearing that mask. So in wrapping up here, I just want to say that it's really interesting to me as I was working on putting this whole recap together to see the arc of this podcast and how closely it related to the arc of my own journey over the last 10 years. It's helped me see how far I've come. And although it was not easy, it has been so, so rewarding. Talk about becoming a new person. I have changed a lot in this time, and I know that those close to me have seen that change. It's just taken time to adapt, for them getting to know the new me and for me being comfortable showing the new me. But I hope my stories and all the people I've introduced to you, the lessons that I've learned along the way that I've shared, the tools, the resources, all of it, I hope it inspires you to take a deeper look at your life and start asking yourself where you're really out of alignment with who you are at your core, and to remind you that you can have any life that you want. You can literally become anyone you want to become. You first have to start by becoming aware. Having good friends can help you with this if they'll be honest with you. If not, therapists or coaches are great. You'll have to start working through some of your patterns and triggers and have the courage to take aligned action. Small steps each and every week and throughout each and every month will result in big changes over the course of years. And all of a sudden, years later, you'll realize that you're a completely different person. And not that you need to change the person you are. If you are happy and you feel aligned and you feel fulfilled in your life, keep going. Oh my gosh, and be an inspiration to others. share your wisdom. But if not, if you find some holes in that, then hopefully some of these podcast episodes give you a good starting point. So thank you for tuning in all season. Thank you for supporting me while I learned how to do a podcast, which was kind of painful at times, to be honest with you, and sometimes even embarrassing. But just to let you know, as for the future of this podcast, I'm currently working on a season 2 outline. Plan to have some interesting guests, of course, talk about some different topics. And while it'll still have the same feel of My Soul Connection, where it's kind of like a spirituality meets everyday life, it'll have a much more focused theme in season 2. When I have a launch plan and I know when that's going to happen, I'll get back on here to let you know what you can expect and when you can expect it. So in the meantime, thanks so much again for the support. And I'll see you when I'm back in the chair for season 2. I don't know. I might have a new background by then. I might be sitting outside. I might be doing something completely different. I'm really not sure, but this has opened up a can of creativity. So I'm going to be exploring that as well. And I look forward to sharing it with you all. So until then, keep connecting with your soul, and I'll see you in season 2. Thanks so much. Thank you for tuning in to this episode of My Soul Connection. If you found the information useful, be sure to rate and review the episode and share it with others as well. And make sure you subscribe to the My Soul Connection podcast so you'll never miss an update. Until next time, keep connecting with your soul.